Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and with me tonight is communications guru and journalist Zeynab Day. How are you doing tonight, Zeynab? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Doing good. Let's see, I've been a journalist about a decade. I used to be communications director at Brand New Congress. I was press director at Justice Democrats. I was the former executive director of Movement for a People's Party. And now I'm looking at just doing some independent journalism, looking for work, sort of in between. And I really I was doing communications for congressional candidates, for, organizations, but I'm really excited at the thought of doing journalism again, investigative pieces, investigative journalism. So I'm just going to do that independently and see where it takes me.
Feel free to bring anything you want to talk about to me. I am always happy to have someone on who has real journalism to talk about. I am not.
You do a great job, Chris.
I am not a journalist, but I try to do a good job of getting journalism out there. I think it's important to be clear on the difference, though. I'm more a propagandist than a journalist, I have to admit.
I went to school for both public relations and journalism. I have got dual degrees, and they kind of coincide, but there's differences. Real public relations, though, is supposed to put people first and have a social responsibility to it. And a lot of people don't realize I actually took an oath to that, and I believe in that. But there's plenty of people out there that practice, but there can be good there can be good messages.
Yes. Well, I mean,
good messages.
I defy anyone to take a look at 1950s Cuban revolutionary posters and not say, this is awesome stuff.
Yeah.
And not just because the propaganda is so effective, but also because they really did the things they were promising people.
Mm-hmm.
They really taught everybody's kids to read, and they really gave everybody medical care.
Yeah.
We can't do that. We can't do anything we promise people, it feels like. Joe Biden would have us believe it's not possible to do anything, I think, some days.
Yeah. Well, they love to shift the blame. The executive branch shifts the blame onto the, legislature. The legislature shifts the blame onto the executive branch. We always think that a president's going to come in and save us, but you're not supposed to legislate from the executive branch. You give too much power to the executive.
People got mad at FDR for that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Nobody let any other president have their way with Congress the way FDR got his, and he was only able to get his because there was a depression, and people were actually worried about capitalism not surviving the depression, which people forget nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, that's where, starting in the 30s, after the crash, the 1920s stock market crash, and that first wave of depression going into the Great Depression, there were talks of communism, talks of, democratic socialism.
Yes.
And the problem was in a lot of countries, such as in Germany, it rose up under the guise of being good for people, but then became an authoritarian regime. So that's I think that's what people are afraid of, but they don't understand the history anymore.
No,
and they don't understand that was used in order to get the authoritarian in, but the concepts themselves aren't broken. It's the abuse of those concepts.
Well, and even Hitler never claimed to be communist. Hitler was always very clear that the first people he wanted to get rid of were communists.
Yep.
And I think that, I hate to say it, people don't like to be this bald-faced about things, but I don't like to pretend that things are better than they actually are. I think Hitler would kind of like our Supreme Court, because while people forget it now, very early on, Hitler was very big about having legal justification for everything. And one of the most important people at the sick business meeting that the Nazi brass had about the Holocaust, where they got the whole party on board, is they actually had conversations with leading judges who were really uncomfortable with the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
And these were people, it wasn't like these people weren't Nazis. These people were Nazis. I'm not trying to say anything good about them or defend them in any way, but these Nazi judges were tremendously uncomfortable with the legal justifications for the Holocaust. They're like, this is bullshit. Yeah. Nobody's going to buy this. And people told them, well, you tell them this and this, and can you bend the law this way? And they found ways to bend the law and decided, oh, it's legal after all.
Yeah.
And it really feels like that's the direction our judges are going, that they want to take everybody's civil rights away across the board, really.
Yeah, I mean, they've been ramping up for this for 60 years. And we always heard, when I was younger, we always heard, thank God we have a liberal court. That's how people would say it, thank goodness we have a liberal court and we can safeguard our rights. And conservatives would say, we're going to replace the court, but they're voters. And the conservatives themselves are just better at organizing. They're more strategic. They're smarter about it. They had a mission, they had a goal, and it was to replace the Supreme Court. And they literally pushed this, the Roe versus Wade, the whole, abortion, the Institute of Southern Baptist in the early 80s and mid 80s, because it was so popular to be okay with abortion, and to be supportive of choice. They actually they were pro-choice.
Yeah. Well, the Southern Baptist Conference did not come out as anti-abortion until 1979. In 1973, they endorsed Roe. Mm-hmm. In 1974, they voted overwhelmingly at the convention to continue to support abortion rights, primarily because
a human rights issue and to bring less children into the world. Yeah,
there were bad reasons too.
Oh yeah,
and I don't want to stay away. I don't want to shy away from the bad reasons. One of the reasons that the Southern Baptist Convention supported abortion was because the Southern Baptist Convention was really into some of the less savory ideas of Margaret Sanger, as opposed to just the Planned Parenthood stuff. And so there's always been a certain amount of eugenics in right-wing Protestantism. It's just a depressing fact of things.
And this is eugenics now.
Yeah.
It's eugenics now because it is the majority of abortions are young white women. And because of that, they're saying, who was it? Amy Coney Barrett, in her ruling, literally said that there's a shortage of babies for adoption. And to me, that's a code for there's a shortage of white babies.
Well, so yes, because their big source of white babies, Russia, was closed down by the Magnitsky Act, because the adoption agencies in Russia were shut down by Putin's order in retaliation for the Magnitsky Act. Mm-hmm. So Russia, no more blonde Russian babies for American Christian parents. And that was what Donald Trump Jr. was meeting with the Russians about, he said, for the meeting that MSNBC made so much about. He said that they were trying to talk about reopening up adoptions again. for that same clientele that gets their prayers and their babies from Jerry Falwell Jr.
Right. But I mean, I don't want to undermine the impact that it's going to have on, Black and brown women to say that the majority of women get abortion are white, because I mean, this is going to have a profound impact on Black and brown women. The maternal mortality rate.
The people who are going to be hurt the most are the people who need abortions the most and have the most trouble getting them, which is going to be disproportionately poor people, Black people, brown people, queer people.
Yep.
That's just how the math works. Even if we didn't have the society that we have, with all the racial baggage that it has, that's just how the math would break down.
It's generational wealth versus generational poverty.
Yes.
A lot of people that are people of color or born in generational poverty, people like Appalachians, others, they couldn't, before even the right was hard for them because you have to pay. When I was pregnant with my daughter, when I first found out I was pregnant, it was going to be $1,800.
Yes.
To have an abortion. I looked at adoption potentially with her just because I didn't know, can I support her? I was scared, that I wouldn't be able to support her. I talked to families. I could not find a family that was not evangelical. Yes. And I just decided, for me personally, the only way that I can make sure that she's safe, she's in a safe home, that she's taken care of, is if I take care of her myself. I don't begrudge anyone who gives up their child for adoption. It was just my choice. But I do know that barrier exists, that monetary barrier for people already existed. Now this has compounded that issue.
It makes it even worse. It makes it even worse because the price was already a barrier. Even when we have rights if we can afford them.
Access. We have access.
Yes, we have access to health care and access to abortion, but that doesn't mean you can afford health care and abortion.
Access to child care, access to student loan debt forgiveness programs, access to,
access just doesn't cut it anymore. Mm-hmm. There's a meme that I love, which is about healthcare, but it has Charlie from the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder looking in the candy store window at this big dish of candy, and it says, "See Charlie enjoying his access to affordable candy."
Yep.
It says it all. And the privacy right that was stripped away by that abortion decision is the same privacy right that would pretty much, almost every civil rights precedent in the books is based on that privacy right in some way. So gay marriage is based on privacy. Birth control between consenting married partners is based on privacy. Gay marriage is based on privacy. Interracial marriage is based on privacy. It seems kind of sick and weird and wrong to think about a Supreme Court justice potentially declaring his own marriage unconstitutional. But I guess he's not worried about the law changing in his state or in the Catholic Church, because he has, of course, a Catholic marriage.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what the state says about his marriage. He's going to believe that he's married because he's married in the eyes of his church.
And he's protected under, can argue a protection under religious freedom.
Exactly, because it's a church marriage. And if the church is willing to, because that's part of this too, this whole, as they cut away the barriers between church and state, Because one of the decisions that I just now remembered was about how churches are allowed to take tax money and what they're allowed to do with it. And they basically eliminated restrictions, at least some restrictions on what churches are allowed to do with money they receive from the federal government. And, I don't begrudge anyone their religion or their church. But how wrong is it that churches are tax exempt but get federal government money?
I've been watching Leah Remini's Scientology. This cult mentality. I almost, was kind of in that environment at Movement for People's Party, to be honest. It was almost like that kind of energy, and I find it fascinating that they have, that the Church of Scientology has a tax exempt status, yet when people come in, you literally have to pay to be a member of the church and to be a parishioner, and you have to pay $5,000 here, $20,000 here, $30,000.
What do you know about L. Ron Hubbard?
Oh, he's a big fat liar. That's
what no, he was tremendously honest about some things.
Some things he said the church is the best business in the United States.
One of the things he said was, if you want to get rich, start a church.
Yep.
And he wasn't lying about that. He's a terrible science fiction writer. I don't recommend any of his books or stories. It's not good stuff. He literally had to start a religion because people didn't want to publish his science fiction anymore.
True. And, the thing is I feel bad for people that are in those circumstances that end up getting fished into this. I'm not just talking about Scientology. I'm talking about, political movements. I'm talking about, a belief in the Democrats or the Republicans. I see a through line through all of this, when we're looking at cults or we're looking at these political parties, because people are desperate, because we're hurting. And they're looking for hope.
Everybody wants to believe in something. Everybody wants hope. And because everyone wants to believe in something, everybody wants hope. And we have so little of it right now. You can't forget that last one, because that matters.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard. I mean, I've noticed that a lot of things have fallen apart since 2020 in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sense of progressive unity against the Democratic Party in Congress. This idea that we're running to take over the Democratic Party has become, we've joined the Democratic Party and we've got to do what Grandma Nancy and Uncle Joe say.
It's true. It's true. And another thing is, we don't have that accountability. We don't see them as representatives. We see it more, in my opinion, there are people that see it more of like almost like a gladiatorial games. Is my team going to win? And there's that sort of
there is a sports element to it that cannot be denied.
And once you vote for somebody, you don't want to believe sometimes that you voted for someone that went up there and didn't do what they promised. That's a hard thing to, just like I said, if it's a pastor and you joined a church and you found out that horrible things are happening within the Catholic Church, for instance, if you're a Catholic, that might be really hard for you to reconcile with. I supported this person or this ideology or this because I wanted good, to find out that there's corruption in it. It's very hard. I mean, you can even see it in corporations when you go and you look at what was the one that the Holmes lady,
Elizabeth Holmes. Yeah. Theranos.
Holmes. I feel like Theranos was kind of like that. People were in it because they believed in it. It had that kind of feeling to it, and people were willing to do things that they knew weren't appropriate or right because they felt like the end goal was a good goal, right?
I'm going to throw something out there at you. If Elon Musk was a woman and Elizabeth Holmes was a man, would their positions be reversed? Because I hate to play a sexism card so early, and especially in defense of Elizabeth Holmes, but I just think about the repeated failed promises related to Tesla. And sure, there's a car. It's not like there wasn't really there with Theranos. There wasn't even really a machine.
Yeah, but and they were illegally blood testing people and giving them false
Tesla
negatives.
was at the point at one point where there really wasn't a car, just a lot of ideas and promises about cars. And Elon Musk came in when there started to be a car and started making very exaggerated promises about said car that could not possibly be kept repeatedly. And I cannot help but wonder, if Elon Musk was black or a woman, would he have been able to keep the con going long enough to be as successful as he became?
He would have had a hard time even getting his foot in the door.
Yeah.
The reason that Elizabeth Holmes was smart in the way that she staffed her whole board with old, white, bureaucratic men.
Yes.
With big names. And so without that, without those names that ended up getting behind her, without the $2 million or whatever it was that her parents gave her to even get it started, without them helping her get her first,
and of course,
distributors, she wouldn't have even been able to start.
That's the reason. That's the reason that things came down, that the law actually came down on her so hard too, because she embarrassed all those important people who went out on a limb to get her started like that. And you reminded me of that. And I appreciate that.
A car is a little bit different than, and
yes.
Don't get me wrong, drug companies, they make outrageous claims. Like, there are a lot of companies out there. This is how it works in business. And that's what I think is fascinating about her story, is that it exposes that as long as you have enough money, you can go and you can bullshit. And you can BS and you can say things if you've got a little bit of backing. I mean, that's how Apple started. Apple started because there was a little bit of money from his parents, and they were able to get some big names in because they were where they were located. And so privilege has a lot to do with it. And she was from privilege. So
sometimes it's even just a matter of perception.
Yeah.
There's a movie called Man with a Million. One of those British movies with Hollywood talent who wanted to make some money while still enjoying a bit of a vacation. And Gregory Peck is the star. But the premise, very Trading Places, and I'm still convinced that the Dukes were based on these guys. But these two old British brothers with lots of money make this bet that Gregory Peck can go a year, or can't go a year, that's the other end of the bet, without spending any of a banknote for £1 million. He can go the whole year with the uncashed banknote. And basically, the one guy's premise is, and this is how the movie proves him right, even though the way events go, he can't win the bet. But the way it works is, as long as everybody thinks he's rich, and as long as everybody knows that the $1 million banknote is in the hotel safe, everybody's bending over backwards to give him stuff for free, and nobody wants to pay him anything. And people loan him money without him having to ask. And one of his friends who didn't know he was rich and who has become successful himself invests money in his name so that he can use his name because he's a famous rich person. He doesn't even put money into the deal. This person invests in his name and says, hey, you're a partner if I can use your name.
That must be the movie that Anna Sorokin watched before she moved to New York.
and then when people think he doesn't have the banknote anymore and that he's really poor, then everybody wants money from him.
Yeah.
And everybody wants him to pay for everything, even stuff that they said was free. He gets thrown out of the place he's staying, all this stuff. And then when he ends up legitimately becoming rich, everybody wants to be his friend again. And he ends up legitimately becoming rich because the investment in the gold mine in his name the gold mine is a bust, but they sell the stock at a huge profit before the gold mine is a bust. So he ends up legitimately rich because of a business deal he wasn't ever part of.
That's a lesson on capitalism. It's it's in who you know, it's in your privilege, it's in your name. And there's such a drastic difference between, generational wealth and generational poverty. And even if you're upper middle class, and let's say that I saw a show where, she said that she inherited this farm from her family who came over during the land exchange in Oklahoma. And it was like, so many acres. And I was just thinking a Black person in the 1800s wouldn't have been able to, but there was so many of those land grant opportunities. There was housing purchase opportunities. We can't underestimate how much redlining impacted communities, and redlining impacted the Black and brown community, and redlining also impacted Appalachia because the coal companies literally redlined from people owning homes so that they could continue Colescript. And then after Colescript was ended, so that they could keep people in poverty and keep them working in coal. So we saw that in Appalachia too. So the generational poverty here is immense as well. So you have it among Black, brown, and oppressed communities. And if you're from generational poverty, you don't have that help to go to college. You don't have that first car purchased for you after high school. You're not going to be inheriting a home from your parents. Maybe, your parents need you to take care of them, not at their fault, but because they're from generational poverty. It's a harsh cycle that I don't hear a lot of leftists talk about enough. I feel like we try to make excuses too much with the middle class. Like, we don't want to make them upper middle class angry. We can't talk about poverty and wealth this way. We have to put everyone in the class war.
I see that when I talk about landlords sometimes, and people say, well, what about small businesses, and go on about this and that and the other. And it's like, well, small business is still a business.
Yeah.
The guy who owns the restaurant isn't running the restaurant and paying his employees out of the goodness of his heart. He's making money. If he's making enough money that he's not starving, and he's still running the restaurant and not selling out and doing something else, he can afford to pay his employees. Otherwise, he wouldn't still be in business. He's making sure he gets paid. He's not denying himself a paycheck to pay his employees in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
So
and
when somebody...
Yeah, exactly.
When somebody says, there was actually a tweet about this. I don't like talking about Twitter, but there was actually a tweet about this. Somebody said, I've done all the work myself and let all my employees go because I can't afford to pay them. And it's like, no. If you weren't making a big profit that you felt was worth doing all their work, you would still be paying them. It's about money, not if you really couldn't afford to pay them, you'd be out of business. You wouldn't be doing all the work yourself.
Yep. And from big business to small communities, there's a ruling class. Even in small communities, there's like 5 or 6 families that have all the wealth. If you take it, yeah, and in cities, it's the same way. In New York, you've got the moguls. You've got 30 to 50 families. You boil it down to London, Kentucky, where I'm from. There's 8 or 9 families that have tremendous wealth, and everybody else is kind of like, we're really poor. And then we have people moving in from out of state because it's cheaper to buy homes here, and people here can't afford to buy homes. It's a cycle, and it keeps going.
Always, it doesn't matter how small a town it is. Even in small, poor towns, there's always the guy who owns all the laundromats in town, or who owns the only McDonald's in town, or who owns the construction company that wrecks the houses when somebody gets evicted or whatever. There's always somebody who's making money if there's still a town there.
Yep. While other people are poor and kind of serving that.
Exactly.
That echelon.
And there's very much, I saw this when I lived in Tennessee. I lived near the Virginia border, so down in the southwest end of Appalachia, not too far from the Kentucky border and the North Carolina, Tri-Cities area. And there's lots of local gentry, and these people with the money, they pretty much have things their way. Because they have the money. And
their roads never have potholes.
Exactly.
The ones that they drive on never have potholes.
And it makes me think about things, because one of these, even if you're not ridiculously rich, just being richer than everyone around you gives you this tremendous superiority complex that makes you feel like you deserve your own way.
Or this idea of, I heard about a story. I was listening to it on NPR. I need to research and figure out who this journalist was, because this was like 5 or 6 years ago, but it was fascinating. He had followed these families, these, upper middle class families for like 25 years. And he followed their children all through their childhood. And one example that he gave as to like the bootstrapping mentality that's kind of a mythology was that he said that there was this family that the daughter had married someone, and they were looking at their first grandchild, and they wanted to buy a home. So the parents were upper middle class, and they said, okay, we'll have a yard sale to help you, but yeah, they had a yard sale, and they sold like, $600 or $700 worth of stuff. But then the parents gave them, like $30,000 for them to make a down payment on the home. But the story that these people say now that they're upper middle class is they say, we did this all on our own. When we were younger, we literally had to have a yard sale for the down payment of our house. And it's like, no. So he said that something that he noticed is that poor people would say where they got help. The rare times that they got help, they would feel compelled to say, well, so-and-so gave me $500. But these people that are from generational wealth, they like more often to say that they bootstrap through it without any help, without any ties, without someone that helped them with their job, or without their college paid for. They did it all on their own.
Donald Trump, whose dad gave him a small loan of $2 million.
Right.
And let's not even get started. There's all the Russiagate stuff of dubious value, but then there's the real legitimate stuff. And why does no one ever talk about this real legitimate stuff anymore? But the fact that he and his siblings were robbing his father blind while his father was alive.
Yeah.
Then basically laundered all the money that was left in the estate after his father was dead in such a way that nobody ever paid taxes on any of it, ever. And it's like, wow. I mean, only rich people can steal on that level.
Yeah.
And from the federal government. They stole taxes from the government, basically.
It's amazing white collar crime, that goes on. We struggle if we get a ticket, or we have like parking tickets because you got to find somewhere to park for work or whatever it might be. We struggle with that. We struggle if we get found with a 20 sack in our pocket in places that weed steal illegal. But these people, like the housing market crash in 2008, these people, they just get to walk away after destroying people's lives. They get to walk away. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, no, nobody was charged with anything over 2008. There were some people who had tense interrogations from Elizabeth Warren, and
she wrote him a strongly worded letter about how disappointed she was.
Well, I mean,
I know.
But yeah, no, I totally get it too, especially because before she was anybody famous, there was a documentary about credit in America, specifically predatory credit. And I remember thinking, this was before Elizabeth Warren was famous yet. I remember thinking as I listened to her talk about poor people getting credit they couldn't afford, and basically she had this idea, listening to her talk, that poor people were these stupid rubes who were being convinced by the bank to take out credit that they knew they couldn't afford because they let the bank convince them they could afford it. When it's more complicated than that. There's very aggressive credit marketing out there, but people who can get credit so they can pay their bills and
so they
still
can
be
own a
able
home
to,
and they don't have
be able to buy groceries.
Because a mortgage is a lot less, even with those inflated rates. Mortgage was still less than rent, and so even though they were paying inflated rates and interest, it was still cheaper than them renting. And then they got to have a home and a yard, maybe plant a garden, and that's, you bring it to a point that I wanted to say. It's not that I'm against the upper middle class people necessarily. I think they have a blind spot. There's a blind spot there, but I say this because I think that a lot of poor people, we have been convinced of bootstrapping. We have been convinced that we can make it there. We have been convinced and shamed. I know, especially in Appalachia, it's like it's almost shameful if you have to get assistance or you have to, and we look at those people and we say, we can make it, we can make it. And then it's like we're competing, but the race, there's always a head start. And it's an impossibility because there's only a limit on how far you can go, at the speed that you can go. So you're both going 50 miles an hour. Someone starts a mile before you, you're never, ever going to catch up. And that's what I think, it's, MLK said, we can't pick ourselves up by the bootstraps if we don't have any boots. And bootstrapping, that's not even what it means. It was meant in World War II, bootstrapping was coined, and Patton was one of the people that used to say it, so they wouldn't leave people behind in the foxhole. They would say, he can't pick himself up, or they can't pick themselves up by the bootstraps. You have to go get them. We never leave a man behind. And so people started saying that in the labor movement, and people started saying that after World War II. What do you expect me to bootstrap? The brilliance in marketing is that they turned it completely around, and that's propaganda, my friend.
Well, I mean, I think there's, I don't know if I would take it that far or not, but there's a whole book. I wish I could remember the title and who wrote it, but there's a whole book about how the beginning of PR is the beginning of the America that we know and love today, as opposed to the America that had real class conflict before the America that we know and love today evolved. And it was a combination of more centralized media control, namely in the form of television, and the fact that because everybody was now getting their information from television, people who knew how to properly relate to the public via television
or stereo or radio. Radio is part of that too. Yeah.
But radio, there was a difference. Radio was never controlled by 5 people, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
There was always somebody with the radio station who wasn't necessarily part of the system. Whereas
newspapers were, though. William Randolph Hearst, you know.
Well, but there was also always somebody with a newspaper who wasn't part of the system, too.
True.
One of the best quotes ever is from an obscure newspaper man whose name nobody remembers, but he was quoted in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance by the newspaper editor in the movie, who's Jimmy Stewart's friend, when he says, "A newspaper should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." And there was always some rich guy with this weird cantankerous attitude. And I'm not trying to be too nice to the rich. I'm not. But there was always some rich guy with a weird cantankerous attitude who was always telling people something closer to the real truth than everyone else, because he was just too cantankerous to go along with the syndicate, the media syndicate, whatever it was at the time. And it was sort of the same. It was sort of the same way for a while with AM radio. There was always some cantankerous guy with a radio station who wasn't going to let himself be cowed.
True.
And it's not like that with television.
No. They took Ivy Lee's standard. They took Edward Bernay's standard, which, like I said, modern public relations that you learn is different. You actually learn about those guys. And at least where I went to school, I went to one of the few like PRSA certified schools in the country, Public Relations Association of America. We actually learned that their tactics were wrong.
Yeah.
You know, but they were the first to say, okay, before Edward Bernays, you know, who was cousins to the therapist back in the day who talks about the ego, and I can't remember his name right now. I'm drawing a blank. And
Freud?
Yes. No. Thank you. No, I have mom brain. We call it mom brain. Like a simple word is there and you can't. But yeah,
no,
Freud,
I understand.
He was Sigmund Freud's cousin. So it was somewhat based on Sigmund Freud's psychology. So one of the first things that he did was when the women's rights movement sparked up, he threw a bunch of cigarettes at the women at the marches, right? In the 1920s, he threw suffragette cigarettes, and he's like, this is edgy and cool. He realized that before Edward Bernays, when we would do advertising in this country and globally, the advertising was based on a product. So you would read about it and it would tell you the details of the products, and products weren't made to age out, to become obsolete on purpose. So planned obsolescence wasn't a thing.
Nope.
The longer it lasted, the better it was. And he's the one that came around and said, we need planned obsolescence. What are you doing? How are you going to make more money? And he's also the one that was like, you don't need to tell them what it is. Just make them feel a certain way and they'll buy it. And the scary thing is he was right. But also he's not the first to do it. You know, major religions, that's what the Catholic Church did when they had to, you know, transition over from, the Celtic religions or the pagan religions to Catholicism, is they sold it like that. They sold it based on emotion. So this is an idea.
And then they changed all the holidays of Christianity to match the pagan holidays, so that they knew the pagans were at church and not the not the Druids.
They made Mary Magdalene look like Athena, like statues of Athena, so that it would sell easier in Rome. They're not Bernays wasn't the first one to think of this, but on the scale, the mass production scale and the immediacy because of television, like you said, that it could be done, you could literally change people on a whim. And I think Edward Bernays is one of the worst people in human history that ever existed, because I think that he was really the push toward this late stage capitalism, that he was one of the linchpins that pushed us toward this late stage capitalism that we're in today.
When I think of the worst people, and these people fit right in with Edward Bernays though too, is because it's the same. When I think of the worst people, I think of Henry Ford. I think of Joseph Kennedy, who people are way too easy on after his sons became reasonably popular. I think of Prescott Bush, who people don't remember enough. All of whom were very, very important in building up Hitler before he became Hitler that everyone was scared of, and was Hitler that Wall Street thought we could make some money on rebuilding Germany. And
they're also the ones that pushed Reagan into Reaganomics and got rid of all of our tax code. All three of those were involved in reversing the tax code so that corporations didn't have to pay taxes anymore. The impact that they've had from Hitler to the 80s, and then their children have had, has had lasting impacts.
Well, I mean, if nothing else, the Ford family has proven that you shouldn't leave football teams in a family.
True.
The Detroit Lions are horrible, and
that's hilarious.
but jokes aside, no, the intergenerational wealth of the Bush family has done a whole lot of harm and has gotten them progressively higher positions in politics. And then W was actually forgiven his sins because of the greater sinner of being Trump. And the one thing we love in our political system is to forgive somebody really awful for being really awful, because now they're on our side.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. A lot of you've got the villain arc in every movie, and sometimes my daughter's like, what? We were watching one great example, but just a small one. We were watching Beauty and the Beast the other day.
Yes.
And yeah, Lydia was like, Belle has Stockholm syndrome. There's nothing romantic about this movie at all. My daughter's brilliant, but I was like, yes.
So here's my question.
Accurate.
Is your daughter has no idea how right she is? Because if you've seen the Once Upon a Time version of Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, yeah.
Well, because Belle is the main bad guy. There are several other lesser bad guys along the way, but the main bad guy in Once Upon a Time is Rumpelstiltskin.
I remember that. I haven't seen
and
that.
Rumpelstiltskin is also the Beast and was married, well, not married, engaged to Belle. And then they ended up being separated by various things. But one of the first season, the only thing Rumpelstiltskin wants is to find Belle, who's being kept in a mental hospital by the wicked queen. And he gets progressively worse as the show goes on and becomes more and more clearly with the bad guys. And it's all because of this very, very messed up sense of love that he has, where it's all about possession and not and not sharing. It's selfish instead of collective, if you like.
Classic narcissistic abuse is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yes. And it turns out that he's a great guy, but is it really that he's a great guy while he's alone with Belle, or are they just Stockholm syndroming about it? Because when you look at their arc in Once Upon a Time, you look at this little point in time where they seem to really love each other, and then you watch how everything that maybe that was just Stockholm syndrome, and all this other stuff is just his narcissistic abuse ever since.
Could be. I think about that. I read the Twilight books when I was young, like in my early 20s, and I was like, because it was an abusive relationship. I was like, why is this being glorified and glamorized? And then 50 Shades of Grey came out.
Well,
but I realized after that, I saw this pattern in a lot of film, and I thought, no wonder women, it's harder for us to see it sometimes because of what we've been indoctrinated to accept because of patriarchal norms since we've been kids, not just women, anyone, but particularly for women.
It was finally taken down for when they got serious about copyright. But for years on YouTube, there was this great video that some very dedicated nerd had patched together, which on the one hand had all of Sarah Michelle Gellar and David Boreanaz's scenes together from the first 2 seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But instead of Buffy and Angel, it shows Buffy's side of the scene. And then the video would cut to the Edward side of a scene from the first Twilight movie. And it would keep going back and forth through the whole Buffy and Angel story arc up until the point where Buffy just gets tired of it and kills the heck out of Edward. And to me, it was just, yes, this is how Twilight should have gone. There should have been a vampire slayer.
That's pretty funny.
But yeah, no, because she's an actual teenager and he's not.
He's like
really not. It's creepy enough. It's creepy enough in Buffy and in Buffy the Vampire Slayer in a way, but and the but here is important. Buffy's an adult when she and Spike have anything going on, and the stuff with Angel is all very confused because there's so much sad puppy stuff happening. That's how that kind of uncomfortable, abusive relationship happens in real life. All that sad puppy stuff.
Oh yeah, it is. And it's called love bombing. There's a name for it. So and that's what it's called. So I was going to mention, this is completely off topic, but we were talking about, we were kind of talking about wealthy areas, places where people can't be, or achievements that they can't have in life because of generational poverty. I'm actually involved in, I know, Chris, that you've been following it with something called Camp Dada. With the Bank sisters and Josana from RBN. She's one of the volunteers, and Lucy from, I believe it's Blue Moon Red Wine. She's one of the volunteers. So we've got several people that are pouring in and helping. We have dozens and dozens of volunteers, but one of the concepts for this first one that we're actually having it in the Hamptons. And I believe it was Lucy's idea to have it in the Hamptons. And we were going to go there because these areas are usually taken by people who are wealthy. So
very wealthy.
Think about, that are very wealthy in the Hamptons. And so we're going to, a bunch of poor people are going to go camping and occupy their space, and also have like camaraderie, talk about organizing, bringing people together. What are the next steps? we're not focused on really electoralism, but, mutual aid, growing the left movement, bringing people together in the left movement. So it's about that. But yeah, just thinking about, even things as simple as like a campsite that's supposed to be for people like us. The wealthy sometimes will go and, they just have, it's a free reign,
Yes.
and so it's a lot of hoops you have to even jump through to even, get the campsites. But yeah, check it out on hashtag Camp Data, at info change camp on Twitter. But yeah, we should be taking and going and occupying and going to their spaces. And oh yeah, there will be live streams of hopefully, I don't know if we have Wi-Fi.
That makes a difference.
We
That
have,
does make a difference.
4G, 5G something, or we may bring some hotspots. But yeah, we're talking about doing some live streams. There will be some actions that we'll be doing in conjunction too. And there's 3 emphasis: healthcare for all, general strike, and why am I forgetting the third? Let's see. I'm drawing a blank. I'm having one of those days today.
This is my life some days, so I understand.
Oh yeah. But yeah, we have 3 main emphasis, and general strike, healthcare for all, and the climate crisis is our third one. Of course, how could I even forget that one? And the climate crisis. Because and everything kind of folds into that. So, when you're talking about general strike, there's a lot of things to talk about. People talk about general strike, but it can be a lot more than just a labor movement. Look at what Ecuador's done. And with what's going on with the Supreme Court, I know, Chris, you and I were going to talk about the Supreme Court. What's going on with that? We're going to have to do something, because this is so crazy. That's
the sort of thing that a national general strike, and yes, it absolutely should be national if that can be done. That's the only way to get enough effective change. If they could get what they had going in India, we should be able to do something.
Yeah. And with Ecuador, they have a list of demands that have, most of them have already started being met, including their gas prices going down. That was one of the things that they demanded. It's kind of amazing. I mean, it's extremely amazing, actually. And then you think about the yellow vest movements in France. It's been done before.
They've had and one thing that our media doesn't like to talk about too much is that Macron has kept the yellow vest movement under control via 2 methods. Number 1, conceding just a little bit whenever he feels like he has to. And of course, just having his cops out there beating the living tar out of them. And I think it's important to study that, to understand that it's not a coincidence that Democrats now suddenly want to give lots of money to cops.
Oh, definitely not. Give all that COVID money, Biden says. Any COVID money the states didn't spend, give it to cops. And the states didn't have to spend that money. And that's why the states weren't giving us services, so that they could go and spend it on the cops. There was nothing that they had to spend it on us. They gave them that money, but there were no stipulations that they actually had to give us rent forgiveness, that they actually had to give us healthcare or anything. They just gave them free reign. And now Biden suggests, give that leftover money to the police. Are you kidding me? Send us our $2,000 checks.
This is good. Yes, they wanted to. They wanted to end mining in parks, national parks, because there was all sorts of stuff going on that wasn't supposed to after Lenin Moreno replaced Rafael Correa. Because we forget this now, because Lenin Moreno is so bad. Rafael Correa was buddies with Evo and Hugo Chavez.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
It used to be Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia against the U.S., and then they managed to replace the government of Ecuador with somebody friendlier to the U.S.
Of course they did.
I mean, it wasn't obvious. It was an election with not an obvious coup, but I mean, Lenin Moreno's the guy who gave them Assange. He pulled away from Venezuela and Bolivia. I mean, he pretty much did everything that the CIA would have wanted from a coup.
Mm-hmm. And right now, if you think about it, we have a coup against the American people in our own government. That's why, like you said, that's why they're arming the cops, because 70 to 75% of Americans do not support restrictions on abortion.
Nope.
Most Americans support the legalization of marijuana. Most Americans support student loan debt forgiveness. Most Americans want more government housing.
Most
Americans support healthcare for all. Even Republicans support these things. Like
most Americans, and while this is more partisan, most Americans still supported mask requirements in public places and at work when states started ending them.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
A lot of people are still concerned about the pandemic. It has not gone away or stopped impinging on the minds of disabled people who are more at risk anyway. Keep in mind that whenever they talk about comorbidities, and only people who have comorbidities really have a problem, they're talking about people they're talking about people with asthma, they're talking about people with diabetes, they're talking about people who are overweight, they're talking about people who are over 40. Hey, I'm otherwise healthy, but I'm over 40. That's a comorbidity. Thanks.
They're talking about people that don't have the money to go to the doctor to get treatment for illnesses and issues that they have.
Yes.
I mean, if
they're
you can
talking
go to the doctor, there's a lot of things, all kinds of preventable.
They're talking about people who were healthy before they had COVID the first time, but have long COVID now. Hey, that's now a comorbidity.
It's awful. I hate it. Yeah. It's rough. And they're talking about poor people. They're talking about everybody, but I keep thinking about poor people because poor people have more combined comorbidities because we can't afford to be healthy.
When you hear about them shutting down hospital access, who are they shutting down access to first? People who can't pay.
That'll be next. You know, they'll say they'll try to retract the treatment if you have an emergency, mandates. That's an older Supreme Court ruling.
Yes.
I've been thinking about that one in the last few weeks, and the news said it again. And I was like, I wonder if they're going to try to reverse that, because then people will literally be dying of heart attacks because they can't get into a hospital.
I will tell you my honest belief. And it's really important that I think as many people understand this as possible, because even when the mainstream media tries to exaggerate it, they're understating this. So back in, say, James Monroe's day, we had a very different system. The only people who could vote when James Monroe was president were white men who owned property. The only people who had any sort of say in anything political were essentially gentry, people who owned property. Andrew Jackson opened up voting to all white men, regardless of their economic status. And I believe that there are Republicans who believe Andrew Jackson was a dangerous communist. I believe they want to go that far back in time to when only property owners could vote.
I mean, it's so crazy because they're trying to be constitutional purist, but I'm like, without certain amendments, Clarence Thomas talking about constitutional purity cracks me up because I'm like, dude, you wouldn't even be on the Supreme Court. You would be 3/5 of a person. You could still be in slavery. What are you talking about?
So let's remember that even back then, there were exceptions. And people don't understand the importance of exceptions in our system, because it's those exceptions that convince people that we really are more democratic than we seem after all. One of the early lights of colonial America was a man named, of independent America was a man named Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker was a free black man from Pennsylvania who had a certain amount of wealth, published almanacs, co-surveyed Washington, D.C. with the more famous Andrew Ellicott. He was someone who was very much an exception to the normal condition of black people of his time. But his existence as an exception does not change the general conditions of black people of his time. But those exceptions always give some people false hope that the system will somehow favor them. And they will be able to better themselves if they just work a little bit harder.
It's internalized too for him, because I feel that he has benefited from where he has gotten so far. And so from the connections he's built, and it's easier to shrug off the struggles that others have when you're one of the few people that makes it over that threshold. It's very easy to then discount and to become a freaking Candace Owens, you know what I'm saying, and start spouting a bunch of nonsense. So
there's always been,
or a Christian Walker. Oh my gosh, that guy.
There's always been a market. There's always been a market for people who are willing to betray their class. And it's that's deceptive too, because once you start to make those connections, things already start to sort of get gray and fuzzy, and you have a hard time. You have a hard time keeping things straight, I think. I don't think people set out to be bad people, but they end up in these wind tunnels or cults or echo chambers, however you want to see it, and they end up believing all this stuff. I think there's a sincere belief that some people think, well, we don't need all these rights because we want the best for everyone anyway. And it's just like, no, you don't. That's the whole thing. You don't. You tell yourselves you want the best for everyone, but people are dying. How is that the best for them?
Right. And you've got the liberal coastal elitist, who always vote blue because that's their humanitarian thing, is to be a Democrat and to vote blue. But at the same time, when it comes right down to it, and you can hear it sometimes when you listen to certain broadcasters speak, even sometimes people on the left, if you listen to certain people that have made it over that threshold, that are from generational wealth, or at least generational, more so generational wealth, they will, sometimes it slips out. It's almost like, Well, no, I've worked hard to get where I'm at. We've worked hard, and then like you have to work hard, and they'll catch themselves. They'll say things like, I'm a little bit nervous about the lines I'm going to have to wait in for healthcare. Well, that's very telling when you hear someone that says that they're a liberal talk about waiting in lines for healthcare because we can't even get it, or we've already been waiting in lines for healthcare. So
no, it's a little silly sometimes. And
these are the people that are supposed to be the people on the left, the people that are, the Rachel Maddows of the world, or what I'm talking about, that most Americans outside of, the inner left
Rachel,
as someone who's a liberal, they're a leftist.
Rachel Maddow went to Stanford with Cory Booker, where they were best friends.
Exactly.
So let's keep that in mind.
Oftentimes they'll have that Ivy League stamp, they'll have that Ivy League stamp of approval.
Stanford is the Harvard
How
of the
often
West.
do you see somebody that went to UT or Eastern Kentucky University or like Ohio State on the news? It's not that often. We have a caste system in this country.
So right now, our current president is the first president not to be an Ivy Leaguer since Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
Even Donald Trump went to Penn and the Wharton School.
Mm-hmm.
But Joe Biden went to the University of Delaware. He went to a state university. Because he went to a state university, he could not get a good job as a prosecuting attorney or as an associate in a nice law firm. He didn't get the good clerkships. He ended up a public defender. Now imagine this, the Joe Biden that we know and love to hate today, a public defender. So when Joe Biden convinces you, well, not you, but when Joe Biden convinces people that he's liberal, he's channeling when he was a public defender and he didn't have any choice but to be liberal because it was his job. The last time he was liberal was in 1971 when he was a county supervisor and wasn't running for Senate yet. And he proposed, and just think of Joe Biden proposing this of all things. It's so bizarre when you think about it today. He proposed bringing housing projects to the suburbs to integrate the suburbs. So his idea was not to let white people run away from the city, but bring the housing projects out to the suburbs so that black people lived in the same zip codes and went to the same schools. Now, this was actually a pretty good idea, but nothing ever came of it because he was just one county supervisor. And of course, once he was Senate, he signed on to the Eagleton Amendment, which then became the Eagleton-Biden Amendment, and ended all school desegregation.
Yep. And he spoke out 7 years later about anti-busing. That just shows you that once people get in, they can get co-opted.
Mm-hmm.
And that people forget that they work for us. They work for us. We don't work for them. We don't need to worship them. We don't need to think of them as a hero. We need to think of them like a person that is up there that is supposed to be voting and working for us. They're literally the employees of the people. And there is way too much hero worship. And when there's hero worship, people can get away with all kinds of nonsense.
It's worse than just hero worship now. It's getting to the point where we are starting to see the upper classes like we're buying into their BS, and that people really are seeing them as better.
Yeah.
I mean, That's why Donald Trump was elected president. Being rich, as people thought he was, meant that he must be great.
He must
He
be
was
better.
rich.
It's like Idiocracy. When they made I forget who was but they made him the top advisor to President Camacho, because
He
he
was
had
the
an
least
IQ of
stupid
60.
person. Hey,
I mean, at
that's
least
the thing.
Camacho was a better president than one we've had in forever, because he went out and he found the smartest person to advise him.
But that's the whole thing. Whatever you want to say about Idiocracy, they were looking for someone smarter. They knew they were stupid, and they were looking for someone smarter. Whereas we have these people who are either incredibly stupid and have convinced themselves they're incredibly smart, or who are just absolute sociopaths at every level of their being and don't care about us at all.
Well, we condone, a sociopathy. Capitalism condones a sociopathy, and that got worse. So in order for them to be able to do the tax cuts in the 80s, because before the 80s, a lot of people don't realize, and I'm sure you do, Chris, but a lot of people don't realize that we did have stop measures in place. There was federal policy that if you made a certain percentage over your lowest paid employee, and you had benefits that your lowest, and they included benefits and everything into the pay. That's why benefits were such a thing. And they had 401ks and retirements and everything.
Yes.
If the percentage gap was too wide, you had to pay more in taxes, and you could be penalized by taxation. Nowadays, there is no, Reagan completely eliminated that. So there is no comparative between
that's
the
why
owners of the company and the lowest paid workers. And
that's why
he eliminated that. Oh, go ahead.
That's why in the 1950s and 1960s, the lowest paid worker made 1/15 of what the CEO made.
Absolutely. That's because
Whereas now the lowest paid worker makes 1/300th of what the CEO makes.
And that's broadening. And, so what Reagan did is they did this whole propaganda push where it was like, work it 9 to 5. Like, I love Dolly. I don't even think she knew she was part of it, but she was. She's amazing. But there was this whole propaganda of wear the suit, wear the tie, work in the cubicle. This is glorious, and the bottom dollar and red, that the bottom dollar, you got to make it in the Glenn Ross, that it was a whole dynamic of the 80s. It was a whole marketing plan in order for them to sell people on this idea that you can become extremely rich now too. That's why we got rid of this tax thing, because that way, if you're a small business owner, and we support small business owners, you can get extraordinarily rich, and people bought into it in the 80s.
But of course,
we're suffering for it now.
But of course, that's where the trick comes in. Because, and this is the joy of our tax system, there's no taxation on corporations. There's no taxation on wealth. There's taxation on income.
Right.
Many small business owners are essentially paying personal income tax on their small business because that's the situation that they're in. They don't have a lawyer. They didn't set up a corporation, what have you. So they're basically paying personal income tax on their small business, which puts them at a very big disadvantage compared to the corporation.
Yep.
And they're supporting the corporation because they see the pro-business candidates all supporting that corporation. But and they're in business too, so obviously they'll benefit from the pro-business candidates. But that's not how it works.
Yep. And you're absolutely right about small business, because it's actually harder on taxation being a small business owner when you're making a smaller amount of money, like what you might make as a salaried employee, let's say, you know, $40,000-$50,000 a year. If you're in that tax bracket, you end up paying more out as a contractor than you would as an employee. And so they don't incentivize. Of course, they don't incentivize not working for corporations. I mean, they're forcing us to have babies now so that they can, you know, revamp their labor force, because the population among the poor community has fallen because less people are having children. So if they'll go to that extent, then they're definitely gonna hit our pocketbooks, and we're paying in 35%, you know, all of us are, in our income and taxes, when somebody who's making $100,000 or $200,000, $300,000 a year, the percentage that they pay in can be less. And then they buy properties. They're buying up all these properties because taxation on property is different than it is on income. So,
and that's the whole thing, is so many people with real wealth don't really pay any taxes but property taxes. And if all you're paying is property taxes, that's not really a very big chunk of your wealth that's being taxed.
No.
Of course, then you've got the added problem of people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Warren Buffett, whose wealth is all in various securities and stocks owned by them or by foundations that they control. And because their wealth is so intangible, they're richer all the time, but nobody can really say exactly why, because it's just a matter of their assets gaining value in the stock market. That's why Elon Musk suddenly became the richest person in the world, because of a series of trades at the same time that the stock market went through the roof. And all of a sudden, stuff that he bought was now worth a whole lot more.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's not real wealth. That's a line of credit. It's just, he's the richest man in the world because of a line of credit.
But he gets to live off of that. You know, I've heard people say that he's not really that rich, you know, it's just, I'm like, but he gets to live lavishly off of that.
Yes, exactly.
You know? And so his quality of life is.
But when you think about that, that makes it worse, because his wealth is theft. Now, obviously, all wealth is theft. But his wealth is even more theft, because it comes from the system of capital aggregation that exists to put the middle class's money at the service of corporations.
Yeah.
While making billionaires richer. And they make you complicit with this. Your 401k now helps fund
people still get those, Chris?
Ukrainian Nazis.
Who still gets those?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to have the best job ever, but I do still have a 401k at my but then I'm a corporate employee. So, I mean, that's.
There are a few people that still get them. That's good. Everyone should. So it's not a bad.
Well, but not 401ks. It should be, we should have a public retirement system like Social Security, only for real.
I agree.
There's no reason.
Really worry. Oh, go ahead.
There's no reason not to put the amount of money that we dump in the stock market to keep rich people rich into Social Security instead. It's quantitative easing that's the real reason there's any threat to Social Security. The rich people want that money. And on top of that, insecurity about Social Security is what drives people to put more money in their 401ks.
True.
Which puts more of our money at the service of billionaires.
That's right. I'm really worried about, we were talking about this earlier before we started. And I know that we've been looking at, you and I've been kind of trading some comments about where's the church going. My friend Thomas Ryko, he keeps showing me, he's like, this is what they're doing now. He's giving me updates every day. But where they're headed right now with turning over the electoral college to the state houses, what they're talking about doing is, having state houses to where, the people in the states may not be electing their electors anymore, but state houses can just give them over. And the thing is, I know a lot of people feel like the January 6th thing is just a distraction, and it is annoying. I know it is, but what happened with the way that the Republican Party was talking to the state houses and the way that they were trying to get those electors in and stuff, that's real. And I know that to me, there's barely a difference between Biden and Trump. Can't stand either one of them. I think they're both awful, but that's not what worries me. What worries me is that, because elections to me, I feel like haven't really done a lot, but it is this slide toward fascism that can impact us in so many other
ways. The slower
ways.
it slides, the better we can stop it, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I have to agree with you about January 6th, but this also feeds back into something I was saying before. One of the things that has changed is that it used to be state legislatures elected senators and not the people of the state.
Yeah.
And this Supreme Court precedent, in addition to everything else, this sort of moves back towards, well, the Constitution says it's up to states how they pick their senators.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that. You're absolutely right.
So you're setting this situation up where they don't necessarily have to elect senators anymore. They can just have the state legislatures pick the senators. And if you've got the votes.
And they have been distracting us with federal politics, the Republicans and the Democrats, for so long that we've completely not paying attention to what's happening in our state houses. And our state houses, the legislation that they have been passing, now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, people are like, oh, what happened? The state house in Kentucky used to be far more progressive. And now it is restrictive and it's mostly red. People say, no, you had Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, but in our state house and our local representatives were always far more progressive. And I don't think people realize that. But people have lost the plot on local elections. They're not paying any attention to local elections. And I feel like it was on purpose. Distract us with this shiny federal, because before people used to care more about local and less about federal. It was the opposite in these.
Remember how many governors and state houses the Democrats lost while Obama was president?
Mm-hmm.
And they all went to Republicans?
Yeah, because Democrats in some of these states, they're not even running people for state house.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this makes me so mad. This is federal and not state, but still, same principle. So in Wisconsin, the Democratic Party sued the Green Party off the ballot.
Yeah.
There are two congressional districts where the Democrats aren't bothering to run candidates because, gerrymander, we can't win. But they sued the Green Party off the ballot. So now the only choice people in those districts have is the Nazi Republican or the Nazi Libertarian.
Yeah.
And the Democrats did that by suing the Green Party off the ballot and then not running anyone themselves.
That's because they're all the same. They're the same party. Yeah. At the end of the day, they've got the same corporate donors. It's the same people that donate to both of them. There's one that's more covert and one that's more overt on certain things, depending on what you're talking about. The Democrats are more covert on their racism, but it's there. They're more covert on their misogyny, but it's there. They're more covert on their elections tampering and their their gerrymandering, but they've done it. They've gerrymandered too. They're like, okay, yeah, you can have this, Republicans, we'll take this. They work together on that stuff.
Of course. The majority and well, nowadays some of the gerrymanders have just been obscenely one-sided, but they used to negotiate the gerrymanders.
Yeah,
the minority in a state like Georgia would agree to not fight too hard on a couple of statewide policy initiatives in order to make sure that when the gerrymandered happened, the incumbents kept their seats.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And now you're seeing, after this system of partnership, now you're seeing the Republicans change the rules on the Democrats and leaving them out. And the Democrats are like, well, maybe if we try to be just a little bit more Republican, they'll cooperate with us again. And that's not how it works.
And that's another thing. These coastal elitists, and I've even heard this amongst the left, there is this misunderstanding that in poor communities in Middle America and Appalachia and the Rust Belt, that they have to swing to the right to get people to vote for them. No, most people don't vote.
Exactly.
If somebody was a true progressive running in those races, you could win. It's all in how you frame things. People will usually agree. It's all in how you present it and not using the buzzwords. And, but Democrats always try to run to the right and they lose because they're running to the right. But when you have somebody that's very distinctive and different from the incumbents,
if they do win, you get Joe Manchin. What use to anyone is Joe Manchin?
What's the difference? There is no difference. And
you say, well, he voted for the Democrat judges. Yeah, but he voted for the Republican judges too. And I would have been willing to risk Manchin voting no on some of the liberal judges if he'd been willing to vote no on some of the Republican judges.
Yep. And this is partially arrogance, Chris. It's arrogance from elitists in DC and elitists in the coastal areas that think that they know how people think, and they think they know what it's like to be a poor person or what runs through poor, because they're smarter in their minds and they believe that they know better than us.
The thing to remember about quote unquote coastal elitists is that those blue states are captive in the same way that red states are.
Yeah.
Though California used to be a red state, and when California was a red state, California's liberals were really liberal. But when California became a blue state, all of a sudden California's liberals stopped being so liberal.
That's right. That's right.
And if you really think about that, so what happened? Well, they got power. And once they got power, they realized that there are all these things that you can benefit from by keeping power, and that the best way to keep power is to be in good with corporate donors. Mm-hmm. The whole reason that the DCCC exists is because the Democrats saw in the wake of the Watergate scandal how much corporate money Richard Nixon and other Republicans were really raking in.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought to themselves, how do we get a share of this? And the DCCC came into being a few years later.
Right.
And the Democrats have been fighting for that corporate money ever since.
Oh, yeah.
And
what are we going to do about it, Chris? What's the next steps? What do people do?
So this is where I have to be careful, and I have to say, I hope people can talk about it more freely on a camping trip than we always can on Twitter or YouTube.
Camp time, guys.
I came really close. I came really close last week when I made a joke. We were talking about the Black Panthers and the African National Congress and other groups. And it came up that, the African National Congress was not a nonviolent organization. The reason Nelson Mandela was in prison is because the African National Congress blew up police stations and assassinated judges. Now, we were talking about the Supreme Court, weren't we? I don't know why I thought the ANC related to that. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. It kind of does. It does in the aspect of, we are of like sort of the extreme nature.
Lifetime. I'm just thinking lifetime appointments. There's a solution for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there is no accountability built in if it's a lifetime appointment. Where's the accountability?
There isn't any accountability. The whole idea of lifetime appointments for judges was that not being politically accountable would make judges above politics. That was the theory.
That was supposed to be the theory. Yeah. And that's what our Supreme Court is supposed to be.
And that's what Democrats were still trying to pretend when they were defending Ruth Bader Ginsburg not retiring.
Yeah.
And the simple fact is this illusion where the Democrats were pretending that the Supreme Court was this hallowed thing above politics as spelled out in the Constitution, whereas the Republicans understand that these are political appointees. Yeah.
And the Democrats knew what was coming, and they had our fundraising emails.
Let's not forget.
2020, we could lose the House, but you know what? If they reverse Roe v. Wade, then we're probably going to win. They knew it.
Let's not forget that the whole period of having a liberal court only came about because Eisenhower made a mistake. Because you have to remember, when Eisenhower made the decision to appoint Earl Warren Chief Justice, he wasn't making Earl Warren Chief Justice because Earl Warren had a long and distinguished career as a judge. Earl Warren was the governor of California who had been one of the candidates opposing Eisenhower in the Republican primary. Well, not the primary, but he was considered the rival candidate to Eisenhower at the convention. There was Earl Warren. There was Robert Taft, who was considered Mr. Republican and was the leader of the conservative movement, the we're just racist enough to get along with Southern Democrats wing of the Republican Party.
Yep.
And Earl Warren represented California and West Coast progress. But he was the governor of California who had been key to the decision that the military made to intern Japanese people and steal their land and give it to white people. So there was no way of knowing that this man would turn out to suddenly be in favor of civil rights as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It was a freakish thing. Eisenhower later said that if he had known Earl Warren would have turned out to be so liberal, he never would have appointed him to the Supreme Court.
Happy accidents.
But that started the period that Republicans hate so much, the activist Warren Court, and the idea that judges should try to make the law fairer for ordinary people. And that didn't last very long. The last decision along those lines, I think there was one really good environmental decision after Roe, maybe, but Roe was really one of the last liberal court decisions, and that was in 1973.
Yeah.
So this is a period from Eisenhower was elected in 52, which means he took office in 53. which means that's only 20 years. The period of a really liberal Supreme Court making decisions that expanded civil rights in America was from shortly after 1953 to 1973 at most.
That's wild.
And that's assuming that Eisenhower made Earl Warren's Chief Justice right away, which I don't think is what actually happened. I think they had to wait for somebody to die or retire. But so at most we're talking 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why it didn't actually go far enough to secure.
Well, no, but I mean, but you think about the famous Supreme Court decisions before that, most of them were pro-business or pro-state. There were very few pro-people decisions. And since then, you've seen pro-corporation decisions. You've seen some pro-state decisions. You've seen very few pro-people decisions that are really pro-people.
That's right. And, we're talking 3 generations.
Yeah.
3 generations since we had an actual liberal court. But now it's gotten to a point, it built up to where now we're in extremism, and they use Trump. Trump's nothing but a puppet. You know what I mean? He's a pompous, arrogant, crazy narcissist that worked really well as a version from what was actually happening, which is Mitch McConnell, and even people on even Democrats wanted some of these people. Even Democrats wanted an Amy Coney Barrett. Don't think that they didn't. They want to rule in favor of the corporations too. Do
you know who Bill Hicks was?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so the grassy knoll joke, where every newly elected president sees the film of the JFK assassination shot from an angle that looks very suspiciously like the grassy knoll. And then the big corporate bigwigs all look at the new president and say, "So do you have any questions?" And the new president says, "What's my agenda again?"
Oh, Bill Hicks.
But I mean, and I don't know if it's necessarily that blatant, but I will say it doesn't matter a whole lot who the president is. There are a whole lot of functions of government, and the Trump administration really showed this. And I think that in a way that even more than losing the Supreme Court, this is what the Democrats hate. Regardless of who the president is, there is a government apparatus that doesn't change much. You've got political appointees at the top, and the political appointees cycle out, and the elected officials change. But the career people at the FBI don't change a lot. Special Agent Joe becomes Assistant Director Joe, finds some high spot below the point where the FBI appointments start getting political. And, he stays there until some politician advances his career or doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But he's there. If he's in charge of the South Manhattan office or whatever for 20 years, he's there for 20 years. It doesn't matter how many presidents they have in those 20 years.
That's right. And I think that's one of the things that's been fascinating about the January 6th hearings are the hearings. People have to realize that there's a whole lot more that's being discussed than what happened on that day. But the hearings, they kind of speak to those inner dynamics. This person was appointed by so-and-so. This person was appointed by so-and-so. And then you get to see you get a little glimpse of the inner workings of the bureaucracy and how they can be manipulated, and how, politics can filter in. There can be some good people that fight against the politics that are just working people working in those actual institutions. But there's also corrupt people working in those institutions. And so to me, that's fascinating look inward, because these are just regular working people like us. Some of them making what, $40,000, $50,000 a year. So
the only reason that somebody, well, no, I take that back. Even in our system, we actually had someone who, when the situation appeared to justify it enough for voters to not care, we had someone who was literally president until he died. And that was FDR, who they literally kept reelecting until he died.
Yeah.
Including when he was on death's door and no one knew it. And it's important to think about that. Even, I mean, the only reason we've only had one president who kept getting elected until he died was because Ulysses S. Grant had some corruption scandals. If Ulysses S. Grant hadn't had some corruption scandals, he probably would have been able to keep being president until he died too. And the only reason that this system has stayed the way it is that presidents, for whatever reason, with the exception of FDR and Ulysses S. Grant, have just followed George Washington's precedent.
That's right.
In fact, there was a period where the Democratic Party was doing this first among equals things, where they didn't think it was appropriate for a president to run for re-election. And they went out of their way to have to replace the previous president with a new guy on the ticket. James K. Polk didn't run for re-election. Franklin Pierce didn't run for re-election. James Buchanan didn't run for re-election. It was a precedent among James Buchanan couldn't have run for re-election anyway. But beyond that, it was a precedent at that point in the Democratic Party that you didn't run for a second term. And the Whigs had two presidents, but they both died. So there was no question of a second term. And so it was just normal for it to be a one-term president, as opposed to now where it's more normal to be a two-term president. The only one-term presidents we've had in my lifetime are Carter, Poppy, Bush, and Trump.
Yep.
And that's in my lifetime. And the only reason Carter is in my lifetime is I was born in 1977, and Carter was president until 1981.
Yeah. I was born in 1978, so we're getting old, my friend. Well, I think that I am going to have to hop off of here in just a minute.
I understand.
My child has opened up the fridge 5 times.
That's probably a sign.
Oh, yeah, I think so. She's like, hungry, Mom.
So any final thoughts before we wrap up then?
Keep an eye. I don't know. I guess just keeping an eye on what's going on. Oh, visit Camp Dada. Hashtag Camp Dada.
Visit Camp Dada.
But just keep an eye on what the Supreme Court is doing. My thoughts are learn how to garden. We got an inflation. If you don't have those means and you live in a city,
I think that gardening is a good idea.
Learn how to can. We can here, in the old glass cans.
Even beyond gardening, because not everybody can garden.
Nope.
You can grow potatoes in buckets.
Yep.
And potatoes are nutritionally complete, which is to say that you cannot starve to death on potatoes.
You can grow on a fire escape. You can grow tomato plants, potato plants,
But you can grow potatoes in buckets under a chair if you absolutely have to. That's the thing.
That's true. Mushrooms too. You can actually grow mushrooms indoors really easily, and they have there are a lot of mushrooms that have really high. But just honestly, I think we need to come together as a people, look after your neighbor, talk to each other. Yes. Help each other out. Just try to make it. I mean, we know that elections aren't necessarily the answer. And
I
wish that I could say what I thought was, other than organizing, raising hell, and taking care of one another. I don't know how much we can do right now.
So there's two things. And the first thing I will say, number one, the only constitutional authority granted to the Supreme Court is the ability to hear appeals from lower courts. There is no constitutional authority. There's nothing about judicial review or saying the court decides whether a law is constitutional in the Constitution. That was all made up by the second Chief Justice, John Marshall, who made up the powers of the Supreme Court because he could, and no one stopped him. Because, hey, lifetime appointment, not accountable. And that's a good thought. That's a good place to end for the night. The Supreme Court has no constitutional power. They have no legitimate authority.
That's a good point. And it wouldn't be the first time that we've ignored rulings of the court as people. So
when Andrew Jackson did not like a specific Supreme Court ruling, Andrew Jackson said, all right, let's see the judge enforce it. When Roger Taney, the same Chief Justice who wrote the Dred Scott opinion, when Roger Taney filed a writ of habeas corpus demanding Abraham Lincoln release an accused spy, Abraham Lincoln ignored it and seriously considered arresting Roger Taney. So even presidents haven't always taken the Supreme Court seriously. So why is Joe Biden taking it so seriously now?
That's true. And, if we want to raise hell, we shouldn't be protesting. I mean, we can protest the Supreme Court, but we should be at our state houses.
Yes.
We should be protesting our state houses because they're the ones that are making this legislation and enforcing it. We should be at our state legislators' homes, not at the Supreme Court's homes. What are they going to do now? Reverse it? Probably not. Go to your state houses, protest your state houses, and protest your state legislators. And
it doesn't do a lot of good to protest the Supreme Court after the fact, but we absolutely should be protesting state houses because state houses can change things.
Yep,
I agree.
It's their legislation on everything that's coming down the pike, from the EPA to what's coming down potentially electorally with, choosing and not voting, not allowing us to vote for electors, to what's just happened with Roe v. Wade. Eva in the comments mentioned ALEC. We're done with ALEC legislation. We're done with legislation written by the corporations. We need to be paying attention to our local races. We need to be raising hell at our state houses and raising hell locally.
And it's not just the Democrat. It's not just the Republicans. Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tom Halloran, who are both Democratic congresspeople, are ALEC alumni.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so that should be kept in mind. And that should be kept in mind when people try to tell you that this would all be better if Debbie Wasserman Schultz's buddy Hillary Clinton had just been president.
Yep.
And I think that's a good place for us to end it and for me to let you get back. Everybody, thanks for being with us. You have a great night.
Thank you, Chris.
Take care, folks. We'll tweet at you.